As Gustav's mentioned, I will be speaking about my experience at the European Space Agency and about the new space economy. And so just to start off, as a short introduction, it's useful to think about the context of this. So why are we even looking at space? Why is a space economy important in the big picture? Well, there are a lot of questions about our place in the universe and about the future of humanity that arise from looking at the space domain. Questions like, what is the nature of space and time? How did the universe begin? What lies beyond our galaxy? What can we learn about the Earth's climate from satellites, from Earth observation? Are there exoplanets out there with signs of astrobiology? How do nations and companies launch things into space? How can we design the right frameworks for space governance, the right policies, the right laws, the right levels of international coordination? And then even more future-oriented questions like, when will we become a multiplanetary civilization? When and how will we have a moon village, a Mars settlement, and perhaps even extend our reach to the moons of Jupiter and Saturn and beyond to interstellar horizons one day? So these are exactly the kinds of questions which we designed the UCL Space Society to tackle. And for this reason, we've taken a very interdisciplinary approach, connecting things all the way from the most abstract level of the philosophy down to the science, technology, the business, and the more civilizational, humanity-related aspects of space. And so a little bit about myself. So I actually founded the UCL Space Society a couple of years ago. I initially did my law undergrad at UCL. And then when I came back to do a master's in technology management, I realized that we didn't have a society that was looking at the space domain at all. And so, as I said, we designed this with a view of space as a new domain of existence. And that is fundamentally interdisciplinary. You can't really isolate space into just the engineering side or just the business side. You really need to understand it from as broad a perspective as possible to get an idea of what's going on. Before my master's, I was also working at this fund called Seraphim Capital. And that's where I really got exposed to space as a growing domain and economy. And I did some research there, and I helped them to analyze space technology startups. And then after my master's, for the past year, I've been working as an innovation analyst at the European Space Agency in what's called ESA Space Solutions, which is based in Oxford on Harwell campus. And so this is in the Innovation and Ventures Office, which is essentially the European Space Agency's department that helps to promote innovation and helps to support companies all across the continent that are either developing or using space technologies in one way or another. So for those who aren't familiar with ESA broadly, it isn't an EU institution. It's actually an intergovernmental organization. So the UK is going to continue being a part of it after Brexit. Switzerland is a member, and other states that aren't necessarily EU states are also either members or cooperating members. And the objective of ESA is really to coordinate all of Europe's efforts and activities in the space domain, but also to deliver benefits to the citizens of not just Europe, but the entire world. And this is very much reflected in the types of projects that we support. And I will tell you a little more about that soon. And so broadly, the activities of the agency can be organized into 4 sections. So there's space science and exploration, which is what most people are really familiar with, what mostly appears in media. Space technology and support, including their work on developing Europe's launch capabilities through, for example, Arianespace. Space weather and safety, which not that many people know about, but is actually quite important, kind of monitoring the risk from asteroids and solar events, and of course, things like space debris around the Earth. And then finally, space applications. And that's where mostly my department, ESA Space Solutions, comes into play, is what can we do with all of these satellites and the infrastructure that we're building around the Earth? What can we do to use that to benefit our lives on Earth and also continue expanding outwards from low Earth orbit and beyond that? So ESA Space Solutions is actually the world's largest space innovation network. And we provide broadly 3 types of support. So incubation, funding, and direct support. Incubation is done through our business incubation centers, and they are located in 24 different countries, spread out across 60 different locations. As you can see on the map on the right, some countries have over 5 BICs located around in the various regions to kind of make sure that we are locally reaching out and supporting companies where they are already based. And we've already incubated over 900 startups, with over 150 per year being added to that list. And then we have business applications, which is direct funding. So companies, whether they're startups, SMEs, or even larger companies, can apply to ESA. And as long as they are doing something that is in some way related to space, they have an opportunity to receive funding from us. And this is done in 3 different types of programs, which we call Kickstart activities, feasibility studies, and demonstration projects. So ESA Space Solutions' general objective is actually to support the UN Sustainable Development Goals. That is the framework that we use to evaluate and track the impact that we are having on the world. And the only requirement is that a company must make use of at least one space asset to qualify for our incubation support or funding. And on the bottom there, you can see actually the types of space assets that we include in that. So this includes, space flight technologies, which is what most people are familiar with, actually just rockets and satellites and technologies that have been used in space flight, for example, in the ISS, but also satellite communications. So direct internet or telecommunications activities, and also satellite navigation. So this is anything to do with GPS. Anytime you're using a location-based app whatsoever, whether it's Uber, Deliveroo, or some kind of mapping application, that is actually connected to a satellite orbiting around the Earth. And so this is also included as one of these space assets that we include in our programs. And then Earth observation, which is a very interesting one, because you can do so much with the imagery that you capture from satellites going around the Earth, from climate science data to tracking the flow of resources, to like insurance analytics, looking at how weather patterns might affect risk in certain areas, for example, flooding, forest fires, and so on. There is really such a wealth of data being produced there that is probably actually the most important space asset that's included within our scope. And then also space weather related things. So this is not talking about meteorology or like climate science. It's actually talking about what I previously mentioned within ESA's domains, space weather in relation to risk from asteroids, solar flares, and other such events. So we have a very large portfolio. Many of them have raised massive amounts of venture funding, and a few of them have even gone public, gone on the stock market post-IPO. So that's great to see, because we've only been running for around 10 years now. And some of the funding themes that we support include things like smart cities, environmental monitoring, maritime logistics, now really something that's getting quite important, 5G networks, the things that you can do with added connectivity, lower latency, and so on. Healthcare services, we've had several funding calls specifically for COVID-19 and for a post-COVID-19 recovery, trying to help optimize healthcare and doing things like telemedicine for people who are in rural areas, for example. Also things like railway systems, more efficient green buildings and green cities, and applications that use virtual reality, as well as a lot of AI, machine learning enabled applications. So I hope this gives you a good idea of what ESA Space Solutions is and how it fits into this ecosystem. So now coming back to the basics a little, what exactly is new space? This is probably not a term that a lot of you have actually heard about, but within the space economy, it's probably the most important idea to understand in order to get a clearer picture of why this is happening now, why suddenly we're seeing all these companies like SpaceX on the front page of news every day. And so to understand that, it's useful to understand the slightly bigger picture context here. So we are now in an age that is called Space 4.0. And this is essentially a multi-agent landscape. So Space 1.0 was pretty much just the study of astronomy and very basic rocket science dating back thousands of years, trying to understand what is this thing around us that some called the cosmos, that others interpreted as religious emanations. And then after that, once we entered the Cold War era, we entered Space 2.0 because there was this thing called the space race between the Soviet Union and the United States. And so Space 2.0 was very much a an explosion of funding for space agencies, and suddenly a race against the clock to see which of the two superpowers within their geopolitical struggle would be the first to go to space, first to get a satellite up with Sputnik, then the first to send a human up to space, and then the first to reach the moon. And the US won that in the end. And this ushered in a new era called Space 3.0, which was essentially an era of international coordination, a lot of scientific missions trying to explore Jupiter and Saturn and its moons better. And in the 1990s and early 2000s, the establishment of the International Space Station, which to this date is still the only place that humans can stay in space in. So really an amazing achievement of international coordination, but still very much only the beginning. Now we are in Space 4.0, and I've called this a multi-agent landscape because we're seeing now the global interaction of not only space agencies, but also private companies and even citizens getting involved in the future of our expansion into space and of the growth of the space economy. And so, as I've said, this includes the space economy, but it also includes things like space tourism with companies like, as you may have seen, Virgin Galactic now, and even SpaceX starting to sell tickets for people to be able to go first to the stratosphere, then low Earth orbit, and beyond. And then, of course, space exploration, very exciting missions to the moon and Mars coming up in the next few decades, and space governance. And this is probably one of the most important for the medium and the long term, is how are we going to design the strategies and the policies and the laws and the frameworks which allow us to expand into space in a safe way and in as much of an internationally coordinated way as possible, because there are many risks attached to doing that, which have to be mitigated as much as possible. So what exactly is new space then within this Space 4.0 context? Well, there are a few different ways of thinking about it. It's not exactly just one thing, but one way to describe new space is very simply the emergence of space startups since around the year 2010. And this, as you can see, has been really dramatically ramping up over the years, both in venture funding and in the number of companies being founded, and in terms of the diversity of different types of space companies that are existing. It's not just rocket companies anymore. It's all sorts of things, from research to in-space logistics to actually even things like commercial space stations starting to be developed. Another way to think about it is a design philosophy. And this is a design philosophy which aims to develop space technology in both faster and in more cost-effective ways than traditional aerospace companies have done up to now. So the traditional ones, Boeing, Airbus, Orbital ATK, and all of these kind of more government, military contracted companies have done things in a slower, more cautious, more of a bureaucratic way. Now we have companies that are doing things with a focus on cost efficiency, on fast time to market, on software-centric solutions, on modularity, on the ability to flexibly change the purpose of a satellite, for example, or have more flexible, more automated mission software integrated into their rockets, and also greater risk, less reliance on necessarily 100% reliability, and slightly more openness to taking a risk, to make sure that they are the first to market, that they are the one that really captured that first mover advantage, that opportunity to make it big. And then also the actual source of funding has been different. Rather than, as I mentioned, being funded just by the military or by government, companies are now being funded by private investors, by venture funds, and also by nonprofits for scientific purposes. And so Seraphim Capital, for example, was the first venture fund in the world to be focusing specifically on space technology startups in this way. And then another way to think about it is companies that are using what's called commercial off-the-shelf components. So these are pieces of hardware, or sometimes even software, that have been developed for slightly different purposes, but that actually can be taken and adapted to the requirements of a particular mission. And so you can see on the right, there's been a dramatic decrease in both the size and the cost of satellites, for example. And these satellite platforms, including CubeSats, which are basically, as it says in the name, just cubes of dimensions that go 10 by 10 by 10 centimeters. These CubeSat platforms have essentially allowed startups to take what is called a disruptive innovation strategy. And so this describes the way in which they've entered the market at a slightly lower end, so a slightly a lower cost product, maybe slightly lower quality, slightly lower reliability. But then just by being able to enter the market and starting to make revenue, they have then started to reinvest those profits and those revenues into improving their product, and eventually, for some of them, actually surpassing the incumbent. So you can see the diagram on the top right there. The entrance disruptive strategy ends up actually overtaking market share and reaching a comparable level of performance as the large incumbent aerospace corporates. And that's kind of what we saw SpaceX doing with their rockets. At the very beginning, they were very much unreliable. People were skeptical about how a new rocket company could just be founded like that. And now they have delivered a comparable reliability to the older rocket companies and a much, much higher performance and cost efficiency. And they are essentially looking like they're going to be the leader in the launch sector for a very long time. And then finally, we can note that new space has been enabled by the rise of low-cost launch vehicles. So as I mentioned, SpaceX, with its reusable Falcon 9, which was able to launch and then land back its boosters on either a barge in the water or a landing pad next to the launch site. And also small satellites. As I mentioned previously, CubeSats have been fantastic for startups to be able to just, for a very low cost, send things up and try something out and do a technology demonstration to see whether their idea is actually viable or not. And on the right here, you can see really the exponential decrease in the cost of launching something to space. Whereas in the space shuttle era, it cost almost $100,000 per kilogram in the 80s to send something up to space. We have now seen that being reduced to thousands of dollars. And with the Falcon Heavy and with the Starship being built by SpaceX and potentially the SLS by NASA, we're maybe going to see this going down to tens of dollars per kilogram. So when you have this dramatic reduction in how expensive it is to send things up to space, suddenly this opens up so many new, both commercial and scientific opportunities for smaller companies, for educational initiatives, etc., to enter the market and be like, hey, I can also launch a satellite. And you don't need to, book a rocket all for yourself. You can build a small satellite, integrate it into someone else's payload, and have it go up to space for really thousands of times cheaper than you used to be able to do. And we're hopefully going to be continuing to see this, and this is going to enable things like space tourism and stuff as well. So now let's have a look at the new space economy. So when I say new space economy, I pretty much just mean the economy that's emerged out of this new space trend. So all of the commercial space sector that's happened in the last 10 years. So as I mentioned, I was working at Seraphim for a couple of years, and we were focusing on companies which enable both the space and the drone ecosystem. And the reason why drones are included in that is actually, you can see on the right there, is just because of the way that we see drones, UAVs, and satellites as being broadly equivalent, but at slightly different altitudes. So all three of these pieces of technology are actually doing similar things. They are either taking imagery of the Earth or connecting things, connecting devices, connecting infrastructure, connecting people to each other. And then, you have drones doing this at a very low altitude, HAPS or UAVs doing this more persistently for longer distances at a high altitude, at atmospheric or stratospheric altitudes, and then satellites doing this in low Earth orbit or even all the way up to GEO, which is one of the longest orbits that satellites are positioned at. So when we were thinking about this new space economy, we decided that we would build something called the data lifecycle. And we designed this to reflect the flow of data and also the flow of economic value from the moment that you build something that's going to go up in space, all the way down to the final product that is delivered from that space technology. So you can think of build as, your basic hardware, software, engines, propulsion, guidance and navigation, the actual satellite platform, and so on. The launch includes what we're all familiar with, rockets, but also suborbital flight, things like high altitude platforms or UAVs. And then the data is the point at which you really collect something. You're either collecting imagery, or you're collecting something like space debris, or you're collecting some radio waves, some telecommunications signal, and sending it back down to Earth. And then the downlink is that transfer of what's being collected down to a ground station using either radio or now laser, which is becoming more prevalent because it's very high data transfer rates. And then the storage of that data, because that data is usually very large. It needs to be stored, processed, often using either graphic processing units or machine learning on top of that, and the security of that data, because a lot of this data is, of course, quite sensitive. It's nationally, in terms of security, quite important. You'll have surveillance and so on being passed down from satellites. And then you have the analysis of that data. What is actually the value that we can derive from an image of a city, for example? You can look at the number of traffic that's going on in a particular street and correlate that maybe to an event that's happening somewhere. You can look at forest cover, for example, in a particular ecosystem, and look at how that's being impacted over time. Look at how climate change is leading to loss of, for example, a diversity of trees or natural habitats for various species. And systems modeling, looking on the large scale at weather patterns, climate, ice starting to melt in the Arctic. Now in Siberia, we have the ice that still hasn't refrozen this far into autumn. So these kinds of insights can be very valuable, both for science and for commercial applications. And then you have the final product. And the final product is, it can be really anything from like location tracking to monitoring of something, to just delivering some kind of insight, for example, as I said, for insurance or for regulatory agencies, or mapping, very simply for something like Google Maps or Google Earth. And even things, as I mentioned, like Uber and Deliveroo actually fall into the scope of this new space economy, because it's all interconnected in the end. And so I designed this map when I was at Seraphim to kind of give an overview of what that looks like. So you have, in the first box, all the companies building stuff. In the second, you have all the companies launching stuff. In the third, companies collecting data, so Earth observation, telecommunications, IoT networks, which is Internet of Things, connecting devices on the Earth to each other. And then on the right of that, you have drones and UAV. You have all these companies that are facilitating the downstream of data. So actually, both the transmission of that data, but also the ground stations that are receiving it, and then the cryptography and storage and security around that. And the storage comes very close to that. And then after you have companies doing the analysis, you have all these companies that use machine learning algorithms to derive insights, whether it's from straight imagery or from radar imagery. There's this imagery called SAR, synthetic aperture radar, which gives off waves of radar bouncing back and forth from the Earth, and that can go even through clouds and even see things in the pitch black of night. And then finally, you have the products there. And you might even recognize some of the companies in the product box, but there are many others. We haven't captured the full scope of things here. This was just my attempts to kind of get a sense of what are the most interesting and successful companies in this ecosystem. And then I expanded this for 2019, and they continued in 2020. And here you can see the current landscape of the new space economy, more or less including all the most important companies. So a few that you might recognize, for example, in launchers, you have SpaceX, Virgin Orbit, Blue Origin, Rocket Lab, which is one of the new small satellite launchers, which not many people might know about, but it's doing quite well. It's based in New Zealand, and it's starting to launch its first customers, quite similar to what SpaceX was doing in its early days. You have companies like Virgin Galactic for space tourism. You might not know many satellite companies, but some of them are really very massive players, like Spire Global, Planet Labs, which used to be owned by Google, and many very large constellations of satellites, some in the hundreds, and soon some in the thousands and tens of thousands. For example, SpaceX, with its Starlink constellation, is going to be launching tens of thousands of satellites to provide high-speed internet globally, no matter where you are on Earth, at presumably a lower cost, actually, than internet service providers provide today. So that gives you an idea of like the opportunities that arise from accessing that area around the Earth. And then, of course, there are many in the analysis part, which most of you probably won't be familiar with, but worth mentioning companies like Resatech, which do natural resource tracking, and others which like Orbital Insight and Descartes Labs, which do a lot of agricultural analysis and, for example, give you insights on how much a field is going to grow, what the moisture levels are in your plants, and so on. And that really helps us to more efficiently produce crops. And in the end, that has an impact on the climate, because if we can do things by using less water and less energy through these insights, we are reducing the amount of greenhouse gases being released into the atmosphere. And then you have at the very bottom the most exciting slice, I guess, which is beyond Earth. So space exploration, missions to the moon and to Mars, commercial space stations, companies like Mana Electric developing self-assembling solar panels for the moon and for Mars, for example. You have space infrastructure companies which do things like in-orbit refueling, so actually going up to satellites and either trying to repair them or refuel them or take them up to a higher or lower orbit, depending on the needs of the customer. And directly space debris removal companies as well, like Astroscale, which are actually going to be sending up spacecraft to go find space debris that might be dangerous because it's going to hit something in orbit and bring it back down to Earth and make sure that it burns up in the atmosphere, or at least put it into a graveyard orbit where it's not causing danger to anything. And then also things like space research. So that includes microgravity research, sending up medical experiments, or things like materials. For example, some fibers benefit from being in microgravity to be able to manufacture them with zero imperfections. And so you have all these kind of opportunities that arise that you would not even have thought about. Manufacturing things in space doesn't sound very efficient, but for some particular needs, it just so happens to be that doing that in a microgravity environment is actually more cost efficient because of how high performance and how high quality the end product is. So you can find this map online, have a look at it in your free time, and you can get in touch with me if you have questions about any other companies. But I hope this gives you an idea of just how expansive the new space economy is. And this is only barely a decade into it. We're going to continue seeing this explosion potentially for many, many more years to come. So what is the European Space Agency doing in the middle of all this? I've mentioned a little bit about ESA Space Solutions, but let's go a little more detailed. So one of the things that we do is we encourage technology transfer. And technology transfer is essentially taking something that's been developed for space or for Earth and spinning it off to the other. So for example, something that's been developed for satellites like solar energy cells, taking the technology that's developed for that and actually using that to improve solar energy, photovoltaics, on Earth. And so that's one example. Another one is things like non-pressurized gas technologies, air circulation systems that have been developed on the ISS, now being used by some companies to improve air circulation in office environments or even in homes. Water purification technologies, again, the same thing, used on the ISS, now benefiting people on Earth. Sustainable food growth, things like insect farming. We had a couple companies that tested their technology on the ISS for insect farming, a component of kind of the box that they use to grow insects, and are now using that to develop a more sustainable food source on Earth. And this might actually be really important for the future of space exploration because it starts to tackle the question of how we're going to develop sustainable sources of food and protein for when we are going on long voyages to other planets or eventually even other star systems. Also things like medical plasma technologies that are being developed on the ISS now being used in hospitals on Earth, and actually chemical sensors that have been used for astrobiological research now being used in industry for things like materials analysis, I believe even to analyze food and the composition of a particular product. So yeah, so many different spin-off technologies. And if anyone ever asks you, what's the point of investing in space? Show them these kinds of examples, because every dollar, every euro that you put into a space research and development project actually ends up returning way more than its value. I think something like 4 to 7 times its value in spin-off technologies and other types of applications that we wouldn't have thought about initially. Another thing that we do, which is probably our main focus, is downstream applications. And I already mentioned this in my introduction, but some examples of the things that we support in order to further the sustainable development goals are precision agriculture, smart logistics, urban navigation, rural connectivity, monitoring of various ecosystems, digital health platforms, and also things like renewable energy analytics. For example, looking at which sites in a particular territory might be the most efficient to build new solar panels or to build wind turbines. And you can really do this by using satellite imagery very effectively, because you can capture the entire kind of imagery space of that territory all in one go, and use AI to analyze that much faster than you would be able to do with one person analyzing drone imagery or something. And then some of the highlight companies that I can show you guys include companies like Lilium. So this is an electric vertical and takeoff landing aircraft, which is essentially a flying car. That's how cool it is for urban air mobility. This is a company that we supported through our German incubation center, I believe are BIC in Bavaria. And it's almost ready actually to launch. And it's going to be able to fly, I believe, from London to Oxford in under 12 minutes, using only electric energy and a set of like 36 turbines on the small personal aircraft. So really cool stuff. The future is coming. It's been a little slow. We don't have flying cars yet, like Back to the Future promised us all those years ago, but it's coming very soon. And other companies include things like Minaric, optical laser communications, which I mentioned earlier in the downlink section of the economy, D-Orbit. They do launch services and also things like space debris removal, refueling of satellites and so on. Open Cosmos, which is similar to D-Orbit, but does more the mission design and the launch integration, taking satellites and finding a rocket for them that is as low cost as possible, that kind of thing. Hyber, which is a constellation of nanosatellites, so nanosatellites being even smaller than your standard CubeSat, for global Internet of Things communications. So you can get a chip by Hyber and put it on any device in the world, put it in the middle of nowhere in the Arctic or in the desert, and it will connect to a satellite and feed back information on whatever it's sensing in its environment. Resitech, which I mentioned earlier, which does Earth observation data analytics. ClearSpace, which is an ESA-backed company from our Switzerland Business Incubation Center, which is really trying to tackle the issue of space debris. So really focusing on going and capturing space debris and making sure that it's out of the way. And Solar Foods, which is a company out of our Business Incubation Center in Finland, which is developing an entirely new way to create protein using just water, air, and electricity. So that's really cool. And that, together with insect farming, might just provide us with a sustainable way to support ourselves on long missions in space exploration. So these are all companies that have been supported in one way or another through ESA Space Solutions. And so when I was working at ESA for the past year, I did something similar to what I did at Seraphim because I love maps and I love ecosystem mapping. And I designed this kind of taxonomy, this landscape of the companies that we've supported. So both through our business incubation and business applications programs, you can see broadly the companies that go from build all the way down to product. So you have more the engineering side, a couple of launchers, drones, satellites, again, space logistics, communications, and then all of these industries on the second box on the bottom that we have been supporting applications for. So, even including things like aviation, health, maritime, entertainment, things like applications for sports or, hiking or, energy data analytics, financial analytics, really legal insurance. There's so many different things. And, it's up to you to explore kind of this whole landscape. I could never give you a summary of all the companies here, but just to give you an idea of the diversity of it, it's basically any application that you can think of that uses space data for a particular industry. So I found that really cool because when I first joined this space domain as a potential kind of career path, I didn't realize how expansive it was. And I think if more people realize that, more people might be willing to actually consider this as a path, because you don't necessarily need to be an aerospace engineer to be able to understand and analyze the business or economic side of what's going on in this picture that you see right here. And so finally, to finish off, what is next in space? Well, there's a few future technologies, some of which I already mentioned. So space debris removal in the short term is going to be very important to ensure the sustainability of our space environment, to make sure that we're actually able to continue launching things up into space without risking colliding with something that's flying around at tens of thousands of kilometers an hour. new rockets that are going to dramatically reduce the price of launching something into space. So SpaceX's Starship is going to be something like 10 to 100 times more cost effective than the current Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy models that they have. Commercial space stations. So there's a company called Axiom Space, which is now developing parts of space stations for the International Space Station. So like inflatable components and extensions to the ISS, and is actually planning on making its entire own commercial space station at some point, which at that point, it can be used for anything from microgravity research to space tourism. You can go and, spend the night in low Earth orbit and watch the Earth kind of floating under you, which is related to this overview effect, which could have a great impact on how people view civilization and society. And then also asteroid mining, which might be very important for how much access we have to different resources. So sending spacecraft up to asteroids or other bodies that might contain large amounts of water or precious metals, and not necessarily bringing that stuff back down to Earth, but actually, if you can find something in an asteroid, you can use that on the moon or on Mars without having to launch that really heavy payload up from the Earth, which is actually the most difficult and costly part of the process of going into space. So if we can send things to harvest large amounts of water from an asteroid and then bring that to whatever we're doing on the moon or on Mars, that might actually be one of our main sources of sustaining whatever type of settlement we have in these places. And then for Mars settlement, and here you can see a render of SpaceX's kind of vision for a Mars colony, which is so grand with like greenhouses everywhere and solar panels and so on, and launch pads for their Starship rockets. And for that, to achieve that vision, we're going to need to develop better technologies related to things like closed loop life support. So having a closed environment that is protected from radiation, but that is also filtering your air, cleaning your water, that has indoor vertical farming, for example, hence the greenhouses. And then more effective methods of solar panel manufacturing, maybe being able to create solar panels from in situ resources, from actually the sand or other things that we can find on the ground, on the moon and on Mars, and also new materials designs, more heat resistant, more flexible, radiation hardened types of materials. So there's a lot to do. It's all very exciting, and it's all to some extent supported by this growing economy. Without the economy, you don't have any of the other things. Even the scientific things are more difficult to make because scientific instruments are also contracted to be manufactured by private companies most of the time. The space agencies will design a telescope or a spacecraft or whatever, but a lot of the time it will be an aerospace company or even sometimes a fledgling startup that will be developing that piece of hardware. And so it's all connected, and that's why the Space Society is trying to make people more aware of like how all of these areas are related to each other, and we need to be aware of that big picture perspective, because without this trend continuing, we're going to see also delays in all other areas of what space agencies are doing. So yeah, that's it from me. Let me know if you have any questions. Hopefully that was good as an introduction, but also going a little more into depth into what new space is and what the economy looks like. Thank you.
Thank you, Bartu. I have a question. I am not sure it's the most relevant.